Hello, everyone. Welcome back to PSF for another episode of the Secular Soapbox, a show where we have strong opinions from a secular perspective and we love to share. My name is Brycearonee, and I am here with today's co-host, who also happens to be the man behind this entire platform, Josh the Archon.
How are you all doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thank you for joining us.
I mostly don't really do these things because I mostly like doing the work in the background and try to organize the actual guests and everything like that, and getting ready for really great shows like the one that we're going to have tonight with our wonderful guests that we have.
Yes, we are. Well, it's appropriate that you are co-hosting today because your background is anthropology.
That is correct.
And it just so happens that we have an expert on this subject. And tonight we are talking race. We're going to be talking about it with Dr. Greg Laden. Dr. Laden is a biological anthropologist and science blogger who publishes Greg Laden's blog, where he discusses a variety of topics ranging from global warming to evolution. He has a PhD from Harvard, and he's also a former professor at that very university. So we are very excited to have him discussing anthropology, specifically as it relates to race, on this show. Dr. Laden, Greg, welcome to Secular Soapbox.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. Nice to meet you both.
I'm sure that I've asked Josh this question in the past, but as you've just seen, I have a terrible memory. I can't even remember when he's on the show half the time. And so I definitely don't remember his answer to this question, but I might as well get it from you, someone who actually teaches it. What is anthropology?
Well, actually, that's a good question. It's a field of study in which the subject of study is human beings, human behavior, human culture. So, for example, it usually has four divisions. Cultural anthropology is a study of cultures, of ethnography, of people in the lives that they live and the societies that they live in. And it is distinct from sociology in that there are fewer graphs with numbers. And archaeology is a study, as my colleague Peter Wells once put, it's the study of everything that anyone has ever done anywhere at any time. But usually in the past, but not always, through artifacts and archaeological excavations of sites and so on. And biological anthropology, well, I'll go to linguistics next. Linguistics, which is not always part of anthropology in different fields, in different universities, is a study of language, but it's also a separate discipline. So most anthropology departments these days don't have a linguist, or if they do, they're a cultural anthropologist who's just studying language. And biological anthropology, which used to be called physical anthropology, and that is a study of human beings from the perspective of evolutionary biology. So it's a study, it is evolutionary biology where the main organism that you're looking at are humans. But every one of those fields tends to branch itself off into different areas. So sometimes you'll run into somebody who's doing the study of language, but they're a biological anthropologist. Or someone who's doing the study of physical bones of humans, but they're an archeologist.
They all kind of intersect, though.
They intersect in all these different places, all these different ways.
Right. And I've taken cultural anthropology as part of my studies as well. So I was not completely ignorant of that. But the way that you described it basically, and I loved your description, as the study of everything anyone has ever done at any time, et cetera, through artifacts. It sounds very similar to history.
You know, that's an interesting point, because when I started in archaeology as a teenager, before I went and got any education, I was doing historic archaeology, and I became proficient in certain areas. And for the first several years of my work as an archaeologist, I was an historic archaeologist. So I think of myself as having some familiarity with history. But when I talk to historians, I don't know what they're talking about. I mean, it is about history, absolutely. But historians have different methods. I guess that's the thing. It's more about the methods you're using than what you're studying.
Yeah, and I think history, when most people think history, they automatically assume the study of written history, things
Right.
that were recorded by others and to be analyzed by future generations, etc. So anything that anyone has written down as a historical document, whether it was or wasn't, is considered the study of history, where anthropology is a little bit more deep, a little bit deeper than that, and that it's not only studying that aspect, but also,
Right.
music, religion, language, the physical, biological evolution, everything that you just mentioned. So it seems like anthropology, I would say, is maybe broader than history.
Much broader.
It's broader in that methodology, and it also tends to be broader in who you're studying, because history, like you said, it's written down. So a lot of history is there's an awful lot written down. For example, in the 18th century, in 18th century America, there's a lot written down, but it's written down by a very, very small and narrowly defined group of people mostly.
Yeah.
And our anthropologists tend to study all the other people.
Anthropology is more of a science, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, cultural anthropologists. When I got hired at the University of Minnesota, I remember the first meeting I went to, and it was all the new faculty and the old faculty were there, and we're all supposed to introduce ourselves. And I said something about how I do anthropology from a scientific perspective. And all the cultural anthropologists said, when they introduced themselves, I do my cultural anthropology from a scientific perspective also. And I realized none of them, of course, were, but science scares people. And the people with science scare the people without science, I should say, sometimes in academia. And yes, biological anthropology is absolutely a science. It's a hardcore science. Archaeology can be very science oriented. It depends. There are people in archaeology who can run circles around everyone else when it comes to isotopes and microscopes and everything else, and others who are doing very much cultural anthropology. And cultural anthropologists often study scientists or study science as an object of study. There's an entire subfield called medical anthropology, which just looks at medicine and medical practices. And that's a subfield of cultural anthropology. And so they're looking at the ethnology and culture of science, which is not itself can be a scientific thing to do, but you're actually stepping outside of that and looking at things like biases and motivations and so on behind what scientists are doing. So anthropology absolutely exists at that a chunk. It's like if there's a Venn diagram, science would not overlap completely with the circles that are anthropology. There'd be a big chunk sticking out of it. That's where we fight. It's that boundary where we fight each other within anthropology.
Good point. Very good point.
And the final question is, what does your shirt say?
Oh, this is a quote. I don't remember who famous people are very often, but it's a famous person. Racism isn't getting worse.
It's getting
filmed. It's
filmed.
Getting filmed.
I think that's Will Smith, is it not?
Yeah, it was Will Smith. Yeah, and I'm wearing it because it actually underscores an argument about racism. Sometimes I've had I actually put this shirt on my Facebook page and to ask when I first got it, because I think he's right, and I thought it was I basically needed those shirts, so I got anti-racism shirts. My more recent shirts are all pro-vaccine shirts, so I tend to go with the current issues. But I mean, I'm living in the suburbs of Minneapolis, so we have been the epicenter of a lot of things lately, right? Yeah. So, and my suburbs, like, oh no, those people are going to come out in our suburbs soon. What do we do? So I'm wearing the anti-racism shirts at the grocery store. Okay. Anyway, I put a picture of it and I said, "Is this racist?" They wanted to see what people would say, and some white people told me, "Yes, it is."
Is what racist?
Is this shirt racist?
Okay, they told you that it was?
Yes, because racism, for two reasons. One, racism is clearly getting worse. And the other reason is because it's not my lived experience. The second part is a good point. It isn't my lived experience. But so some of my white friends said that, and some of my African-American friends said, "Are you crazy?" It is not getting worse. If you just take any scale of time, of decades or centuries.
Well, let me say that with respect to the second part of the thing you kind of defended by saying was true, it is not your lived experience. However, that doesn't make the statement untrue.
Well, it also isn't my statement.
Right.
It's somebody else's statement, and it is his lived experience.
Yeah.
As
I'm
opposed,
pretty sure it's most people who are African American would probably attest that it is their lived experience as well.
right. Plus, he's in the film industry, so he might know about that part too.
Yeah. So, what is race? You're an anthropologist. Is race, what does race mean?
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, I'm a biological anthropologist. So if I just step back for a minute and say I'm going to be an evolutionary biologist for a minute, from an evolutionary biologist point of view, race is a word that has traditionally been used interchangeably in animals with subspecies, and in plants, the term variety is often used, although you might use either one. And it means and of course, when we do biology, we have species. And an ideal species, a kind of a well-behaved species, is one in which everybody in the species, all the animals, interbreed in some way, so that the word population and the word species mean the same group of animals. But in reality, a species that's widespread will have actually groups over here that interbreed with each other, and they don't really know anything about the group over here that interbreeds with each other, although that difference is not perfect and there's some exchange or it's temporary, but you get enough of a difference that those groups will become biologically different enough, and there will be different races. So this was a concept that was really appreciated by a lot of late 19th century explorers who were doing biology.
I wonder why.
Well, no, just talking about animals for now. Just about animals, okay? Non-human animals. One of my favorite examples, I think it was Schweinfurth. Schweinfurth is one of the guys who named almost everything alive in Africa, right? He just traveled through Central Africa, and every tree he came across was not previously unseen by Western eyes, so he named it, okay? So everything is just in this Schweinfurthy, this and this Schweinfurthy. One of the chimpanzee subspecies is Schweinfurthy.
Is that bonobos?
No, it's just one of the Pantroglodytes subspecies in the eastern branch. And so I think it was him that named like 15 species of leopards. So he'd go somewhere, shoot a leopard, and then he'd like get the pelt process. He'd go somewhere else, shoot the leopard, get the pelt process, and look at the two pelts, and they'd be different. So the spots would be different. So he called them two different subspecies. We now know that every individual leopard is different. They're like fingerprints, the spots, okay? So he made like 15 subspecies that were all just one species.
They were all just leopards.
Right. They were all just leopards. And that is true of many of the subspecies designations made. There are, when you take two species or subspecies and make them into one, it's called syncing them. So there's thousands of subspecies that have been sunk once biologists realized those differences are not, they're either actual differences, but it's a cline, or they're just not real, they're not genetic features or whatever.
Yeah, I'm into ornithology, and it irritates me when I see distinctions being made between the eastern blue jay and the southern blue jay and the mountain blue jay, and they're all blue jays, because the distinctions that they talk about are so minute as to the fact that only an expert viewing them up close would be able to tell the difference, and they can all still interbreed with each other. And the only reason they look different genetically is because they're in different locations. But if you move them, they essentially would become the other subspecies. And so it's kind of a ridiculous thing to me, but
that's a good example. So there are subspecies in some species, like common chimps. Common chimps live in 3 different groups that have been separated from each other for a very, very long time. They have pretty distinct features. They're not that different. The average person seeing 2 or 3 chimps from each group wouldn't see the differences necessarily. But if an expert said, "Yeah, look at this, you'd go, "Oh yeah, that makes sense." And then you'd see the consistency. And then when we look at their genes, we see that the genetics variation in those chimpanzee groups, shows a lot of similarity within each of the 3 groups, and the 3 groups separate out very nicely. So there are 3 distinct races of chimpanzee. When we look at their behavior across those races, the first thing you find is that one of those races of chimpanzees is heavily studied and the other ones are not. So suddenly it's like, well, we can't really say. 2 of them are studied enough to make some comparisons. The ones that crack the nuts That's a Western group that's not studied as much as the Eastern group, the ones with the termite sticks. Jane Goodall's chimps, okay? So, but when you look at the chimpanzee behaviors, it turns out there's a list. I don't know how long the list is now, but it's 100 and something behaviors or whatever. Using termite sticks a certain way or clasping hands a certain way. Just these things they do.
Mhm.
There's this long list, and any given group of chimps does a bunch of them. And every single, it isn't the subspecies that do different ones. It's a community of chimps. These are all behaviors that they share in a community where they interact. And every community has a different list overlapping with other communities. And then when you look long enough, what the list is of behaviors that a community does changes. And on top of that, some of the behaviors, like one where two males hanging around, laying down, resting, will grab each other's hands and hold them. It's called a handshake or something. When they do it, it's consistent in some groups to certain conditions. In a different group, the same behavior is done under a different condition, which makes these things symbolic because they're not linked to a fixed reality. Their meaning depends on the context. And it's
Question
arbitrary.
for you on that. You have a chimp that's raised in one subgroup population.
Mhm.
Let's say you have a baby chimp
Mhm.
and like a newborn, and you take it from that population and bring it to the other population. Let's put aside whether it would be accepted or not. But if it was raised in the other population, this other subspecies or this other race, would it adopt the behaviors of the group that it's around, or would it hold on to the behaviors of the subspecies it came from?
Yeah, obviously we don't know that for chimps because you can't do that. But we can look at their nearest relatives and see what happens when they do that.
Okay.
And that's humans.
Mm-hmm.
And with humans, when you swap babies, the babies do not take their cultures with them.
Right. It's kind of where I was going with
Yeah.
this, where this whole idea of race. So when we extend that to human beings and the human population, that kind of makes race not really a thing anymore.
Yeah.
It's really culture, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, a great way of thinking about this is to imagine going back to about 1100 AD in Europe, because we have a lot of information about Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got two brothers, let's say, Sven and Oli. Okay, they live in Sweden in the north.
Well, they would have to, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they both decide to go. They're going to go on a trip, and they're going to go south, just to see the world. And Sven gets out with his walking stick, and he walks to southern Sweden. He gets on a boat. He ends up in Denmark. He goes through Germany, and then whatever. Oh, he ends up in Hungary. He goes down the Danube. He ends up in Turkey. He goes to the Levant. He goes through what is now Syria, Israel, Egypt, northern Sudan. Eventually, he's in the Congo. Takes him 20 years. Which of those days of that 20-year period did he wake up and go, oh, I just left the place where all the white people live, and now I'm in the place where all of the Middle Eastern people live? Oh, I went to bed last night on a boat going down the Nile and in the Middle East, and now I'm in where everybody is black. I must be in Africa. There would be no point in which in 1100 AD, Sven would see any change. He wouldn't even notice.
Yeah.
He would never see it. Meanwhile, Ali, he does it a different way. He gets on a boat and he leaves and he ends up in England and finds out that people are kind of the same as they are in Sweden, but not as many blondes. And they talk funny. He gets on his boat and goes out into the Atlantic and he lands in Morocco. And suddenly everybody's really different from him. Totally different. He never has a chance to learn the language and everyone looks different and the customs are different. Then he gets on his boat, goes out back to the Atlantic and ends up in Ghana, what is now Ghana. He goes to 3 or 4 places. He sees races.
Mm-hmm.
His brother doesn't.
Because it's not gradual. For
because
him.
it's not gradual. That's a very good example. That's a really good way of putting it.
They're both seeing the same exact thing, but at different scales. Now, obviously, the other thing you can do is get a bunch of people and get them to move somewhere. And there's lots of natural movements or historical movements that people get up and move somewhere. Suddenly, Texas has a bunch of people from Haiti. Right? I mean, that's happened, right?
Yeah, and it's literally happening right now.
Right. Where I live in the Twin Cities, when I moved to the Twin Cities several years ago, our backyard had been loaned out to a group of Hmong people who could garden there. the house we bought.
Mhm.
And I suddenly I was living among Hmong people, and they're nowhere else but California, and I think maybe Detroit. There's like Hmong people are like 3 places at that time, 25 years ago, in America, because they all came in a very short period of time, 100 airplane flights, whatever it was, evacuated from Laos. Everybody has that. These days has some kind of history like that in the United States, except for Native Americans, and it may have happened years ago. It's happening now. It might, So that's the same as Ali's traveling great distances between point A and point B.
Mhm.
You see people just get different because of that. So the way I like to put it is that the formation of races is something that happens when a momentous event occurs and people flee or move or are enslaved and captured. The disappearance of races is something that happens very, very, very slowly, mostly at night.
Good way of putting it.
When people end up just marrying each other and just blending over time, and just the differences go away because some cultural barrier that might have been there goes away, and people don't care anymore.
So who defines race today? If we look in American, you are from the United States?
Yeah.
Okay. And so am I. Josh is kind of a Canadian, but sometimes American, depending on what arguments he's going to use. As we are all North Americans, who is in charge of defining race as we view it from the North American paradigm?
That's a good question. Well, first it's defined in part by history. Because people have terms that they use. So obviously America was divided kind of between people who were Europeans used to make a lot of distinctions among themselves, but let's just ignore that for a while. So you had, lots of Europeans, and you had Native Americans, and you had enslaved Africans. And anybody else,
which were the 3 relevant groups at that time.
The 3 main relevant groups at that time. And that's kind of interesting to think about that way, because if you go into the 19th century, at some point, a lot of people show up from China.
Right.
And that is when the Congress decides to define. They'd already obviously defined a race. So they said who could vote, who could enslave someone. I mean, they'd already defined races, and to some extent. But the first specific legislation about immigrants was in relation to Asians coming in, and that was sort of an explicit definition of, we now have a 4th race. So in that context, around that time, you do have biological anthropologists, the precursors of bioanthropologists, so wouldn't have called themselves that, forensic experts and physical anthropologists and so on. A lot of them were just medical doctors. A lot of this early research was just done by medical doctors, using racial distinctions to determine things like who could be sterilized or should be sterilized.
Which laws apply to who?
Eugenics.
Which laws applies to who? The eugenics. And then the other side of it, the good side of it, which is let's solve crimes by looking at skulls and describing the person based on the skulls. And that was actually might have been, the ability to tell races apart, races which don't actually exist apart, using skeletal material in the United States and probably Canada forensics, was reasonably possible in the 50s and 60s.
I was going to say viable up until when?
Yeah. And even then, though, it was like 70% right. You'd be right about 70% of the time, which isn't that good.
Why wouldn't it work today?
Well, first of all, because there's so many people who have, when I was teaching at the University of Minnesota, I used to use for an oral exam for undergraduate, I had a skull that I could use, and it has been repatriated since, so I can't, we used to have a lot of skulls, and anthropology had skulls laying around, and now they both put back where they belong. This one hadn't been yet. And I would show it to people and say, what is what's the ethnicity of this person, and what's the cause of death? This is for students studying forensic anthropology. I had some students doing that. And the markers on the base of the skull were clearly Inuit Eskimo, no question. The teeth were absolutely, without a doubt, African. And other parts of the skull were very Native American. By the standard things you look it up in a table. This thing is like a pyramid versus a round thing. It's therefore, so it was a mixture. And so it was actually Peruvian. native, like from the Andes.
Wow.
Oh, so they were wrong.
They were just wrong, and that was just some other people that weren't in the sample. They were Native Americans, though. They should have showed up in Native Americans, right? But they didn't. And in the skull was a large copper spearhead, so that was the cause of death. So that was easy. But and that's how it works. It depends upon who you ask. I mean, Bill Howells, who was at Harvard. Harvard's famous for having invented a lot of these race concepts, but they also did a lot. They also had people. It wasn't the university that did it. It was the people at them that did that. But I overlapped briefly with Bill Howells. And Howells is famous for going around and measuring all the skulls and doing a statistical analysis to see how we can sort out races among all the people. And he had the largest sample of any body up to that date. And his conclusion was, everything overlaps. There's no races. You can't do this. And that stuff he published in the 60s. So Boas said that based on his study of skulls. He said there aren't races. Everything overlaps. People, cultures, physical appearance of people, languages, and the bones too, all overlap too much. This one guy, I'll show you this book. This is Philip Rushton, Canadian. And Americans look at Canadians and we with admiration. Like, you guys have it together more than Americans do a lot of ways.
We really do, Josh. It's all out of jealousy.
We
right?
do. But not everybody. So he died a few years ago. He was a tenured professor in Calgary. And he's one of the people who defined races using... This is a very interesting study. If you go back and look at the early data, you'll see a lot of Germans and some Americans and some French and some English scientists measuring skulls and making assertions about them. And there's a few things you see in the early data. One is they're trying to measure brain size, trying to understand brains. Humans are fascinated with their own brains, right? So they're looking at brain size across groups, samples of people from Africa, from Asia, Native American, whatever. And you see a few things in the early data. One is that there isn't a lot of variation in brain size that isn't correlated directly to body size. And the correlation is kind of poor. So even little people have big brains relative to body size, and big people have small brains relative to body size. The brains don't vary much. By the way, our eyeballs don't either. If you've been to a study of eyeball size across humans, we all have the same exact eyeball size almost. And brains are pretty much the same too, okay? There's not a lot of variation. And when you look at the early data, you don't see much variation. At some point in time, like in the 1880s, this one skull shows up and sticks out of nowhere, gets its own publication in some journals. And it's the first Inuit Eskimo skull to show up in the sample. And its brain size is just off the charts giant. And people, and the European scientists were like, that's interesting. But they didn't really care. Even the ones that were serving a racist paradigm, because there were no Eskimos living nearby. There were Hungarians and Serbs and stuff like that living nearby. And those are the people that they needed to prove were different. They didn't care about it, some Eskimo skull from Canada. Okay. But Americans did a little bit more. Okay. Anyway, the point is there isn't much difference. When you just take all the skulls that were measured in 1860, 1880, 1870s, and put them on a graph by racial groups that were assigned to them, you see there's just not a lot of differences between these groups. And then over time, the differences start to get bigger. So samples of data presented in publications in the beginning of the 20th century and through the 30s, okay, across the world, the African skulls get smaller and smaller and smaller. These are often the same exact skulls that have been remeasured. And when you look at the measurements, you say, well, how did they do this? Well, first of all, there's more than one way to measure the intracranial volume of a skull, but usually you're holding mustard seeds, you take them out, put them in a big, flask but it wasn't remeasuring, it was recalculating. Okay, because there are ways to calculate the brain. If you have a brain, it's going to be different than the inside of the skull. And a lot of these measurements also were measurements based upon the measurements from the outside. Okay, so you have this Frankfurt plane, you orient the skull, you take measurements from the outside, and you can then estimate the endocrinial volume on the inside. Okay, but you need to use a formula. And somebody figures out, gee, we could use a different formula for different samples because maybe there's different numbers in there somewhere. And the samples start to get adulterated. So the two things that happen is African skulls get smaller and white skulls get smaller. But white skulls only get a little bit smaller and African skulls get a lot smaller. And that's because they're using increasingly biased formulas. And everybody's skull has to, the brain sizes get smaller. Everybody's brain size has to get smaller because you have to make the brain smaller in order to get some of them a lot smaller. Okay?
So it almost sounds like you're saying that there was an agenda here to make African people dumber.
Yes.
Biologically dumber.
To make the brain size smaller, and then there's of course a theory that links brain size to intelligence.
But that doesn't sound like science to me.
Well, these were so. Then you look at the other. You take the same numbers, sets of numbers, and you recalculate them a different way, and you say, "This is me being very subjective, but I can guess if you're a racist scientist or not, based upon the stuff you write in your journal articles." About the inferiority of Africans, for example, or maybe you're a South African scientist working at the University of Pretoria, and you're paid by the government to prove that Black Africans are inferior to white Africans.
Yeah, like that's not
to perpetuate an agenda as well, right? Because it's a political agenda that kind of associates with the scientific.
Right. And when you divide up the samples that way, you find that the racist scientists, based upon some slightly independent evidence, are the ones with the biggest biases in the skull and the brain size estimates. So yes, that's how, oddly enough, the data that are used by people like Rushton to show that the inferiority of Africans and the superiority of whites, and by the way, Asians are slightly more superior than whites are, by his formulas. The original data shows that there isn't anything to this other than the fact that the farther north you live, if you are living at temperate versus Arctic brain sizes are a bit larger than temperate brain sizes. Temperate and tropical, it isn't like you go from the tropics up, the brains get bigger. But if people who live in really cold environments tend to have extra large brains.
Why?
Something about the thermodynamics. Something about their body shapes are all different and everything. There's a really strong selection on not freezing to death in the Arctic. So everybody gets shaped slightly differently, and the brain just inside the skull gets a little bit bigger.
And we should be careful to mention that the size of the brain is not directly related to intelligence. Intelligence is only related to specific portions of the brain, like the frontal cortex and the cerebral cortex, basically. So if you're talking about the brain, like if you're talking about other areas of the brain that don't necessarily relate to intelligence, they could be bigger, but that doesn't translate to intelligence potential.
Exactly.
Yeah, it does.
Or IQ.
And that's the other measurement. Okay, so IQ is also a measurement that's been used to differentiate races.
Mm-hmm.
And I can go back to Rushton again and give an interesting example there. The first IQ test was designed at a primate research institute in order to do something they needed to do in the American Army, in the American military at the time of World War I. They were drafting people, and they wanted a way of sorting out the conscripts, so they thought we'll give them a test. But a very large percentage of Americans were not literate in the 1910s. And so they couldn't do that. It's like, so they came up with a non-verbal IQ test. So everyone in the room would be shown a picture. Then they would have a multiple choice question that they'd fill out the answer to. And maybe it was just a one answer, but it was a very simple answer set for the picture. They change the picture. So this is in the Army, and you get a room full of people, the American Army, and there's a corporal up there giving everyone the test to see who else is going to be a corporal versus a private. In a segregated army where the corporal doing this is white. So,
and the person who designed the test was white as well.
That's true, but I assume that's true. Yeah, well, we know who they were, sort of Sanford Bernay. But and so never mind the test stuff. Let's assume the test is fine. The test is fine, and you've got a white guy up there testing rooms of white people and black people, and there's a lot of ability to influence the outcome of tests in a group of people by doing anything from just writing down the wrong numbers and faking it to giving people less time or something. Okay, so there's probably a bias in that level of test. The bias in the test itself that's written is it was before any test. It was the first test, folks. It was the first uniform multiple choice test invented on Earth by our species.
Wow.
Now,
I did not know that.
yeah, anybody who does testing knows you've got to modify your test and improve it all the time to avoid all the screwy things that are in it when you first make it. Okay. One of the best examples of a question in there is our two drawings, like stick drawings of a boy and a girl, or young man, young woman, wearing tennis clothing with tennis rackets in their hands, standing in a big rectangular area. And the question is, what is missing in this picture?
What is tennis?
Right. The answer is in net. But you can only answer that if you know what tennis is, which was not a widely used sport. I mean, it was very widely played in the wealthy areas of Long Island.
By white people.
By white people. It wasn't played by African Americans from Georgia.
Yeah. Right. What year are we talking?
This would be 1917, 1918.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Great Society, or the Lost Generation time, right? The Great Gatsby, that they're playing tennis. Okay. So it was a bias test, and it gave a difference between African American and white American conscripts. The white American IQ, if you translated it to today, taking those tests, would be just under 80. And the African American would be like just under 70 or something like that. Okay. Now, there's a test that was done by ordered by the Pretoria government, racist biological anthropology scientists at Pretoria. The South African government needed them to sort of add more proof to the idea that Black Africans were inferior to justify apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
So they decided to give this test to township kids. I think they were all girls. So these are kids that were in school, but they were young, and they were in a really crappy educational system. They were given that test, the same test that had been discarded. This is in the 1960s. Okay. This test was invented decades earlier, but it was a nonverbal test. These kids could read and write. Right. They were given a nonverbal test, and they didn't know what tennis was either. So they got an average of 70 IQ points on that test, which is not how IQ is actually calculated, but that's how they did it. And so Rushton takes that evidence and says, see, 70%, if we look at modern day African Americans, their IQ, according to the bias IQ test, is something like 85. The kids in Africa, their IQ was 70. White Americans, their IQ is 100. We can explain why that's true in a minute. And he calculates that the intermixture between Africans and Europeans in America is exactly right to predict that, assuming a perfect relationship between genes and IQ.
Sure.
So independently of skull size and brain size, he's showing this genetic relationship between races based on the data I just described, which is clearly, obviously, very bogus data. Now, if you give a population of people an IQ test, the average IQ of that population is always 100, because IQ tests are not assumed to be unbiased. So you just you average a test out. What is it called? You curve the grade. Okay, you always curve the grade. Otherwise, it'll always be above 100 or below 100 or whatever. You curve it so the average is 100, and you figure out who among your population of people are exceptional, either very low or very high. And that's why you do the IQ test, to find those individuals and retest them and find out, are you really a genius? Are you really someone with a learning disability? And then that gives you more. This is the good use of IQ, which isn't done so much anymore, but that gives you more measures as an educator to help people, blah, blah, blah. You don't do it to characterize races by giving the uncalibrated IQ test that we know doesn't work very well and giving it to a population and taking the answer as gospel.
I think it's important for the benefit of the audience to, we've used the term, we keep calling them scientists, and right. Sure, they had degrees in science and had possibly conducted science for their dissertation. You know, they've done scientific experiments, whatever the case may be. But I feel like people, when they hear the term scientist and they hear scientists conducted an experiment, they just assume science is being conducted.
Yeah,
right.
But
right.
None of these things that we're talking about are science. They don't do any science here at all.
And I agree. And I think that's why you can kind of call these particular individuals either propagandists in a sense for a particular agenda, even though that, as you stated, they were scientists, but it's just that their scientist was more for a political gain rather than some sort of actual science to figure out the actual
Well, once the
truth.
government comes to you and says, I want you to find this result, you're no longer doing science.
Right.
It's pseudoscience at that point. It's
Good
like
point.
creationism, you know?
I would say
We need to
pseudoscience
find
or just evil. Let's call it what it is. They're evil scientists.
Good point.
Dr. Evil.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is not, and it's not a simple situation at all. There's what is one thing that people often do is they assume time has a horizontal similarity. At any given point in time, everything's the same as the next point in time being slightly different. There were people doing this kind of stuff in the late 19th century, right up through the present. And at the same time, there are people who are also studying similar things that are coming up with very different results and very different conclusions since all the way along. So there's always been people who said this is bogus in the scientific fields, that this is bogus, that these data are bad, or that there are biases. At the same time that there are people working very hard to prove differences aren't really there for their, and I don't see, I don't know if I would say that it was for their political gain. That's one thing that is partly it, but I think if you in the absence of a world in which people these days, right now, when a really bad racist event happens, you have people speaking out about it uncomfortably or against it. Okay, in the 1940s and 50s in the United States, it would be very hard to find people doing that. There would always be people doing that, but it wouldn't be normal for a news reporter to say this racist event happened when somebody was lynched. They wouldn't really say that. They don't see it and present it that way. So these people who had jobs as scientists or academics, they were really more interested in just their own academic ideas being right. You know,
good point.
It wasn't even a big political agenda. It was just they wanted to be right. Well,
I'm sure they wanted money and grants and all of that as well.
Well, but they weren't. Most of those people already were the people with the money.
Good point.
This is before that. So they were just people sitting there in their Victorian mansions doing. A lot of these people who are working at institutions like Harvard, they didn't even get paid much to work at those institutions. They had their own independent money, and they just wanted their ideas to be right. They were clueless.
Good point.
And they wanted their Victorian mansion to be properly taken care of by their servants, and to not have the masses out there uprising. They had their political reasons to do things, but it was even more thoughtless and in some way, and it, you know.
So in a sense, it was for their own private gain in order to perpetuate a system that worked for them.
It was, yes, it was more of a psychological psychopathy than it was a well thought out evil plan.
Right.
I think that there is another possibility that we may all be overlooking. I mean, I think all of those other answers are true as well. Logical, reasonable, fit the facts.
Right.
But I think that the other possibility is that they were just racists.
Well, yeah.
That exists.
Big time.
Because
but
when
at the same time, isn't race taught though? Like that's the one thing. Like there's different. Like don't get me wrong. Yes, there is the environment, and sometimes if something happens at a quick pace, it might change people's mentalities about a specific individual or people. In a sense, I hate using people, but a certain variety of humans coming to a particular town, let's just say in the United States, could spike this type of racist thought process. But I also think too that just like in your example beforehand, Dr. Greg, that you were stating that it's the process of how we actually go along through that trajectory. If it happens too quickly, our thought process of race appears in a sense, and we see the other. Sure. But if we go through slowly, then in a sense we're kind of educated by our experience and by our phenomena in a sense in order to see that it's really not that different. People aren't really that different from us, even from different skin color.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that they were racist and they're also the people that are they were in the business of actually creating racism. I think a really important point is American racism. Okay, a misconception people often have is that racism is going to emerge no matter what. That is kind of built in. People are always going to have a fear of the other, or a kind of xenophobia, and people often will say this is because we evolved as people living in small groups, and we were always afraid of the guy over there in the next valley was going to come and take your stuff. Our ethnographic studies of actual people tell us that that's not a model for how foragers live. Mm-hmm. Foragers have a lot of long distance connections. They know that people over the next valley are people they don't know, but they want to know them, and they want to interact with them in a positive way. When you go and find examples of outsiders intruding in remote areas where there's someone living there, they're almost always afraid of the outsiders. That's because you're not the first outsider to show up. And the last guys raped some of the women or took some of the food.
Convert them to a religion.
Yeah, exactly. So of course they're getting, but that's not the normal situation of our evolutionary history. Racism does not occur automatically. And American racism in particular, it's not necessarily completely unique. There's going to be things like it elsewhere. And there's other kinds of racism in other places. But our racism is based on a specific colonial history. It's tied into our economy. If you look at the economy, just specifically about racism against African Americans specifically, our racism in this country, if you looked at it in relation to the economic gains and losses, that explains like everything. If you also look at it from other points of view, you can also explain everything. There's all different things going on here. Okay. But
Dr. Laden,
yes.
I want to hear the rest of what you have to say, but if you had to categorize the discussion we're having right now, how would you label it? What terminology could we use to assign to the type of discussion? What are we talking about right now?
It's a little bit like critical race theory.
Sounds a lot like critical race theory. Yeah. And I only brought that up because a few moments ago, Josh, you asked the question, something to do with, don't we all learn about race and racism? And the answer is no, because a lot of people don't want to learn about it. In fact, there's people actively trying to discourage the teaching. The entire conversation we had right now is what certain people want to be illegal to be taught in school.
Right.
Which is
right. But I'm just saying, though, is that when we look back and kind of, again, like Dr. Gregg stated, when we look back towards America's history, America only transferred the racist ideological thought process from Britain, where majority of Americans actually come from. Don't get me wrong. Yes, from Denmark and all the rest of these other areas. But when we're looking back at the 13 colonies, I apologize, the major influence is from Britain. And Britain was, at that particular time, an extremely racist or ideologically racist nation.
And I would say that maybe our racism has evolved a little bit even more since then.
Well, certainly. Yeah.
I mean, we started off there.
But it was because, just like how Dr. Gregg stated again, it did because of the economic advancements that individuals saw that was beneficial, in their eyes beneficial, towards their economic advancement. So that's the thing, is that would you want to change a system that would be towards your detriment, or would you want to perpetuate the system that is actually benefiting you, even though that is harming other individuals, such as African Americans? And that's what I think was the outcome, was that, of course, it adapted, but it adapted because of the economic socio situation that they inherited from Britain itself. That's how I see it. I could be wrong.
No, I think it's true. It's also true, though, that by the time slavery was illegalized in America, Great Britain was already on its way to eliminating slavery in all of its colonies.
Good point.
But they evolved in a different direction faster than we did.
Much faster.
The other thing I think is really interesting, and you mentioned before, like that I studied archaeology, so therefore it's like history. It is, and I pointed out that actually I often don't understand what historians are saying because I'm not trained in it. In the last, for reasons that I think are similar to why John Meacham, who's a conservative guy, but started his podcast, Hope Through History. It's kind of fun to listen to. He talks about cases in history. When you listen to him, you go, oh, that kind of explains the Trumpers, and he's talking about the 1930s. Anyway, I started reading a lot of history, more than I ever usually do, about 5 years ago. And it's really interesting to just try to characterize, just make a list of all the ways that white Americans primarily, but not everyone was white, like including Frederick Douglass, but Americans from whom literature we have of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s in the United States, including Lincoln, right? Including Frederick Douglass, including the abolitionists, the Southerners, all these different people, and try to make like a Venn diagram or a chart. Like right now, what is racism in America? It's pretty simple. I mean, some people are more racist than others, and some people are more racist against some groups of people than others. I helped a little bit with a race exhibit that was designed in the Museum of Science here in the Twin Cities, and I went to meetings with students to talk to them about race and racism. And we found that students from highly multicultural neighborhoods had a really complex and confusing view of race and racism. It was just like you couldn't characterize racism based on listening to these ninth graders. It wouldn't give you a clue what was going on. You'd see racism, but like, what is this? This is more like interpersonal reactions than anything else. But America, we have a racist paradigm, but they were splitting hairs from Washington through Lincoln. The ratings of the presidents alone, they were splitting hairs. Are Africans humans? Are they the same as whites? Some people said yes. Some people said they have the same rights, but they're not really the same. The Spanish were arguing Sepulveda debates: do Native Americans have souls or not? And if they do, are we responsible to change those souls into Christian souls? And if they can't be, are they worth being alive? I mean, the decision at the end is, do we exterminate them, or do we enslave them, or do we put them in prisons? That's on the table. So they go to a conference every day for several weeks to figure out what's the answer to the question, what to do. Kill them, enslave them, or put them in prisons.
Did the conference look like a big round table with Dr. Evil sitting at one end and Frau and number one and
It probably did. They had funny hats. Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, that was the kind of, so the view, I mean, just people think about their Democratic Party versus Republican Party. Southern Democrats wanted to preserve race, wanted to preserve slavery for really solid economic gain. Northern Democrats weren't interested in that. We're split. Some weren't interested in that. They were actually many were against slavery. They thought it was immoral. And they were still Democrats because the Democrats had taken up the issue of, believe it or not, this might sound familiar, infrastructure. They were the infrastructure party then. The Northern Democrats were, but other Northern Democrats were morally against slavery, but recognized its importance to Northern mills. So they were troubled. They were literally troubled. Like, I don't know what to do. So the views of slavery among everyone who was white, and plus Frederick Douglass and a few other African Americans, the view of slavery just has so many permutations about what people thought, and that is just astonishing. And people were walking around with these views and expressing them without any kind of sense of shame, or that it was considered unusual to have these thoughts. And it was partly that lack of shame that allowed people like Lincoln, who I think actually had mostly good views of a lot of things and did good things. He was an admirable president, given the time, in a lot of ways. He felt he was against slavery. He thought slavery should go away, and he thought it would go away, but he respected the Constitution too much to be an advocate against slavery until the Constitution was changed, which is very different from what you'd think you'd be against slavery, like a little bit more vehemently than that.
Yeah, the Constitution's a living document that can change at the drop of a dime.
And he did change it. But he could have done, some people, we can look back and say he could have done more to change slavery, the situation with slavery, than he did, regardless of the Constitution, which he did ultimately cause to change. But from his point of view, he couldn't. And that was not considered I mean, Frederick Douglass took up the task for it. Okay. Not everybody agreed with this, but my point is, on the Senate floor or the House floor or in the newspapers, which are all owned by political parties, the conversation was just way more complex than we have now. And every possible permutation of attitude was there. And that's the context in which people were measuring skulls, and people getting on boats and describing people around the world. And it's just not, I don't know, it's extremely complicated. And that's the basis of, those are the same people that were building universities and colleges and developing curriculum and making laws.
Yeah. Exactly. President Lincoln, to be fair, had made enemies during the course of his presidency. Enemies from within, enemies from without. He was assassinated, for Christ's sake. He was the only one of only two presidents that was assassinated. So clearly, he was making some unpopular decisions. We have a favorable view of him today in light of how our society has grown and perceived race, and especially as we compare him to other presidents. It's very clear that he's one of the best we've ever had, but at the time, there are probably people who would not be particularly happy with him, both for his decision to act on emancipation and for his slowness or perceived slowness
Right.
to do so.
Right.
He was being attacked most likely from the left and the right.
Yeah.
Whereas he's venerated by both today. Back in the day, probably not so much.
Yeah. And the point being that our current allowable conversations about race and our attitudes about race and racism and our understanding of it is way more sophisticated than anything in the 19th century, but it's also actually much more simplified. But to get back to a point that you were making before, it really, I encounter all the time people assuming that racism is going to happen automatically and you have to fight it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's built into our psychology, just like, because it's built in. It's just going to happen. It's hormonal or it's neurological, and it's built into our species for evolutionary reasons. And the evidence that we have for that is very weak. And the evidence that it is constructed as a cultural phenomenon is very strong. And one of the most important pieces of evidence that this is a cultural construct is probably the fact that everything we do is a cultural construct. Pretty much. And we know that's true because we know a little bit of how it works. We know that human beings are the only primate where a high percentage of babies or mothers die in childbirth. That's such an evolutionarily stupid thing. You got to have an explanation for it. And the explanation is our very large brain. Well, if we just got a smaller brain, that wouldn't happen as much. Then you look at what's the brain for. Well, the brain is a thing. It is poorly connected and poorly constructed at birth compared to other primates. Other primates can eat earlier than we can. From the time they're born, they can grab onto their mother and hang on.
I think you probably meant it's less developed rather than constructed.
I mean, physically, the neurons are not hooked up.
They're not there yet.
When they're there, they're actually, what I mean exactly is that there's 10 times more neurons than we need in certain areas of the brain. And they're just connected to everything's connected to everything else. There's no design in there. And over time, they call out and get connected properly.
Right.
Okay. And that whole process.
I think we were saying the same thing.
We're saying the same thing. But most people don't get. They think that the neurons. They don't think. Most people don't realize that's how the brains develop. And in humans, it takes. Human babies are useless and need constant care. Toddlers are worse. They're basically suicidal. They're constantly trying to kill themselves. That's only true in humans. Other primates don't have that. This stage of about 5 years of childhood is when we develop our brains, and it's when we develop our language, our symbolic thinking, our understanding of our place in relation to other humans. And all of our basic behaviors and abilities are formed during that period, and they don't come from our genes. They come from the cultural setting we live in, which is why if you transfer a baby at birth from one culture to another, they'll adopt a new culture. When you transfer someone who's 6 or 7, they're going to bring their old culture with them, but they're still quite malleable and they'll adjust. And maybe 10 years later, you won't ever know that they were from a different culture. So racism isn't a separate thing that is built in. It's just one of those other behaviors.
Yeah. And it sounds like basically a very elaborate way of saying it's mostly a social construct.
Yeah.
And
yes. An anthropologist, I would say a cultural construct. A sociologist would say it's a social construct.
Right. And so this raises the question for me, if that is obviously known, why do we still pretend that it's real? Or why do certain people need it to be real? Why do we categorize race? So we really depend on these racial categorizations in the United States in particular. I mean, and everywhere from criminal justice to housing to when you look at anything where there's a racial disparity, we track this stuff and we talk about, I hear people saying, oh, when I look at someone, I don't see race. One that we
Colorblind.
know that's bullshit, because this is the United States, and the entire culture here revolves around race. It was built on literally slavery. It was built by slaves.
Yeah.
We've never not had institutionalized racism in this country. So when you say you don't see race, you must be just a blind person who doesn't pay attention, or you're lying. And I think most people are aware that we recognize race in this country, and we treat people differently based on what our society defines as, what boxes we put these people in.
Yeah, I think the codification of race in normal day-to-day life, especially legal matters, made sense at one point. I remember the first time I ever took out a loan, and the guy who was actually not white, who was a loan officer, said, "I have to ask you what your race is." And so I said, "White." And he said, "Good. I just have to ask that for when people like me are sitting on that side of the table and people like you are sitting on this side of the table, so we know everything's fair." So in other words, you actually are required by law to keep track of things like that, so you don't have biases in the real estate industry and banking and so on.
Yeah. How nice of him to ask, though, because there are other institutions in this country that don't ask.
That was nice of him to ask. But the point is, I think what you're maybe getting at in part here is that also, once you get past a certain point, that actually perpetuates the problem. Are we at that point yet? I look at some young kids like my son, and I see him hanging out. I mean, we live in an area where he's not all white kids at the bus stop. He's in the minority quite often. And he doesn't seem to even pay attention to any of that. I think he's kind of colorblind. I mean,
how old is he?
Well, 11.
Yeah.
And so I think this is about the time when you stop. Maybe if you were at that point, maybe it changes.
Yeah. And you said Minneapolis, or a suburb of Minneapolis?
A western suburb of Minneapolis. One that's undergoing a very rapid cultural change. So our high school in the last census was 89% white. 10 years ago. Today, the elementary schools are white minority majority.
Oh, wow.
That's a huge difference. It's a huge, and then right. So it's changing really rapidly, and some people are freaked out about it. Most people are pretty happy about it here. It's a relatively liberal sub-enclave here, more or less. We do have our CRT people and our crazy anti-vaxxers. We have a lot of them too. We overlap in different. And the point is, I think I agree completely with what you say about color blindness, but I think the age at which that is retained in some subcultures is getting older. It's still pre-high school.
Good point.
And it's maybe happening in more places, and maybe, but on the other hand, you don't have to.
Well, that would be great, and that supports the notion of what Will Smith said, of what your shirt is saying.
Right.
The idea that racism is not getting worse. I agree, it's not. I think that, well, I'll ask you, and I don't want you to give me your thoughts on this, but I want you to tell me how, in your experience, other people around you would perceive this. Josh is like I said, he's Canadian. He's also part American. What race is Josh in the United States?
In the United States, he'd probably be white.
Okay. Josh, are you white?
No, my father is African American. My mother is Caucasian.
Okay. Now, who decides which is true? Who categorizes Josh? He's pulled over, or he's in a court appearance, or I don't know. He's filling out a housing application. And I agree with you. Most people, and Josh probably agrees too, most people who look at you probably don't see a black man.
Oh yeah, a lot of people actually just see past that. They're just like, until I state it,
right?
A lot of people just don't know.
Yeah. And then what happens when you state it?
That's when everything starts to change.
Everything starts to change. It seems
a lot of times they're like, forget about that. Focus more on your benefits rather than your negatives, in a sense. And after I'm like, but I don't see that as a negative.
Race in this country, to me, seems to be based on other people's perceptions, and also it's based on self-identity, but it's largely based on the reason I think a lot of people self-identify when they're ambiguous is because, one, they grow up in a culture where other people around them don't necessarily look like them or can't pass necessarily. And two, they're aware of the fact. I'm sure this has happened to me before, Josh. I'm not exactly the blackest person in the world. I'm sure you've been in a room before where you have heard white people make racist comments about black people, assuming that you weren't black.
Right.
That's it. Exactly. I've definitely 100%. And it's kind of weird because it's kind of like an incognito effect because of my skin color and stuff like that, that a lot of people kind of feel more relaxed around me. So they think that, okay, well, he's along with us, so I can say something. It's not really going to offend him. Where internally it actually does. And a lot of times I do confront these individuals once the thing is stated in order.
That most likely inspires you. That doesn't inspire you to be more like them racially.
No. Right. You're learning how to be a
Like,
racist. Right.
You're not like, oh yeah, I'm just like them, therefore I'm a racist just like them. No, you're going to point out, hey, my father is black, so.
Oh, absolutely. But I think it's also based on circumstance as well, right? Because my father has constantly been always like a part of my life, and also at the same time was always pro African American and also pro white. For him, he wants people to kind of see past the color barrier and be sort of just love. Sorry about that. Love each other, not through the color of your skin, but just for the person being having integrity and not lying and so on and so forth, these type of things. So I was always sort of around that with my father and with my mother, who is Caucasian as well and has the same thought processes as my father. So there was a lot of influence that was there, but I don't know if I would have grown up within a racist household, and let's just say my father wasn't there most of the time. I don't know if the thought process would have been different or not. Right? Because it's all based on the cultural circumstances of your environment and where you grow up. You adapt. So
I want to say this, and then I want to give Greg kind of the final thoughts here because we're coming up on 1:30. But if you were in the United States, Josh, if you were in Minneapolis and you were pulled over by the cops for whatever reason, they may or may not feel threatened by you. But let's just say there's an altercation of some kind, not fatal. You're arrested. They take you in. They may ask you what your race is. But for a lot of black people, they wouldn't ask. They would just, if they appear black to them, they're labeled as black in the system. You know?
Yeah.
If they appear passing to them, how they're labeled might depend on whether or not they let them go or whether they're arrested or convicted. It's all determined by the state.
That's right.
That is some of the bias that exists in the institutionalized racism that exists in the United States. And I feel like I don't know how to get over that because people deny that even exists in the United States.
I think the issue there is because and I think the issue comes from mostly the Civil War, for instance, because let me finish what I'm saying. I'm not saying the Civil War caused this. I'm saying that the way that Grant, when he came in, Ulysses Grant came in after the Civil War, what he did was he appeased the South. He didn't want to change the South. He appeased the South in the ways that they did things and wanted to kind of unify the country once more. And for that, he utilized appeasement. So that means that the South was able to still have that thought process without being hindered or prosecuted for that thought process in the first place, and able to perpetuate within Jim Crow laws and everything like that went all the way until early 1980 or 1990. And let alone, we saw it in 2019, and I hope I'm not getting this number incorrect, or maybe 2020. It might have been 2020 with the death of George Floyd, for instance, or the blatant death of George Floyd. So
murder.
It's exactly.
Yeah.
So when we're really looking at this, I think that the ultimate underlying issue is that do we allow people and it sounds more authoritarian, I know, but it's just a thought process that I have, is that with these tendencies, and for people able to explain and to express these tendencies, seems to be some of the underlying current that pulls other individuals that think like them into the fold. And I think the thing of appeasement is the problem here, because the more that you appease individuals, the more that they think that they have a free reign of letting loose everything that they have within their thoughts.
Are you talking about Trump?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And not just Trump, but the Trump supporters are even, and I'm not saying all Trump supporters.
Sure.
I'm just saying that certain Trump supporters who have that type of ideological thought process as well. Right. And that's the dangerous aspect, which can lead to great fissures between individuals within society, and sometimes unremedied fissures. But now we're getting into politics, and that is the thing. So
so let's let Dr. Laden comment or respond to any of the points that were brought up there. We kind of talked for a minute. But
sure. I think that since we're talking about the current situation of racism and recent changes, before Trump, I think you could say fairly that we were on the road to improving things, but that was moving on a very, very, very slow vehicle, slow enough that circumstances outside of that change could easily reverse things. And it was 2 steps, 3 steps forward, 1 or 2 back at best.
Yeah. And also that trend that we were on triggered a response, which was Trump.
Well, to be honest with you, I think that the election of Obama was simultaneously a great movement forward and caused this huge threat. And Trump is the response to that. Trump is because we elected Obama. And I wrote something at the time when we elected Obama, and I saw the effigies being hung and burned. And I wrote a blog post saying something like, this might be the last black president we can elect in a long time.
At least in our lifetime.
This might have been a huge setback rather than an advancement, through no fault of Obama's or anyone else. But a big part of fighting racism is getting people to shut up. Those people who you talk about, Josh, in your, that say racist things. This happens inside households, and the kids grow up to be racists. Okay, but then they encounter school and other parts of society where they find out that what's going on in the household isn't really widely accepted, and slowly they're more likely to grow up as less racist or non-racist, slightly more likely, than to be more racist, if society is keeping a lid on it. But it takes a long time for that to happen. When suddenly there's good people on both sides, like Trump said, suddenly it's all backwards. Suddenly we've gone back by a couple of decades. Suddenly, I think we can maybe. I don't know how bad. We don't know how bad it's going to be, but that is a big set backwards. Okay, but you always have to ask the question: how is it that? And I don't want to play identity politics here. I'm just speaking as an observer of culture. Okay, but one day Joe Biden, when he was vice president, accidentally said something about gay marriage, and within a few weeks, the policy in the military was changed. Today, gay marriage is a standard automatic background piece of our popular culture. I mean, it isn't even the funny thing anymore. Like, gayness went through a period of, it's comedy. Let's deal with gayness by having it be comedy, and have there be entire TV shows where there are gay people in them, and things like that, like Queer Eye for a Straight Guy, and so on. It's now just simply in the background. You watch a British baking show. One of the people has a partner who's the same sex. It's like no big deal.
In fairness, black people were like that on TV once too.
Yes, but the transition is so much slower.
Yes, that's true.
The transition in gay marriage or in gay is like instantaneous, culturally speaking. Okay, and with Africa, for the longest time, there was actually a union, maybe an informal union, of African American movie actors, who were all of the African American actors, almost all of them, and they were almost all porters and butlers. Okay, that institution existed, and for decades that was movie blacks. That was it.
Right.
Okay. Then we went through a period where being a black family was funny. And, because of All in the Family, being black got brought into the conversation because of Norman Mailer. And then we had black comedy. And then we had eventually black TV and everything else. But and that transition is happening. And now in the industry of entertainment, we're way beyond that now. We're way beyond that now. We're no longer that, but racism's still there. And it's just taking everything you do takes so many more steps. And I think that's true because the racism is inculcated in the individual over their childhood and their upbringing in a very large percentage of our households around the country.
Yeah.
So people walk out, and a very, very tiny number of them. I had that experience in a very large way. I was raised up in a white working class neighborhood that was also Christian, and Jews were. We later moved to a Jewish neighborhood, and that was like, wow, this is exotic. Okay, but
well, it wasn't New York City, I can tell you that.
No, it wasn't. It was Albany, New York. But my friends were all racist, and everybody was racist, and everything around me was racist, except it didn't come up that often, but it was there. My neighbor over the back was Japanese, so he got to play the Jap when we played Army, because all of our parents were in World War II. Okay, and his father was an American soldier who was in Japan, who had died since of some natural cause later. His mother was Japanese. Anyway, but my father was a very specifically anti-racist person, and he was a guy who grew up in the black neighborhood, and he was a guy that when he became a Prudential insurance salesman, and Prudential said, "Do not sell insurance there," he said, "Okay, I'll be the guy that sells insurance there." And when he hooked up with a real estate brokerage, and they said, "Don't buy and sell with those people, Joe," he said, "I will be selling and buying houses there." And then he was tapped to work for the urban unit of the city, and eventually became one of the country's leading leaders in the field of public housing.
Holy.
In Chicago, he went to a meeting in Chicago to give the keynote address. He got up in the morning at the Hilton Hotel and got a cab, tried to get a cab to Cabrini Green. Cab driver wouldn't take him. Took him close. He walked into Cabrini Green and walked around and met people, just went up to people and said, "Hi, I'm giving a talk. The vice president of the United States, I think it was, the mayor of Chicago, and the head secretary of housing are going to be at the talk. What do you want me to tell them?"
What year was this?
This was in the 80s.
Okay.
He spent the morning at Cabrini Green. The mayor of Chicago came to Hilton Hotel to pick him up on the way to the conference, and they couldn't find him. And the doorman said, "Yeah, he went to Cabrini Green." They called the cops, and the police rushed to Cabrini Green to look for his body. Meanwhile, he got a ride from somebody to the conference, and he gave his talk. When I was a kid, he brought me to the inner city neighborhood where he worked, and there was a limo. It was a Sunday afternoon. There's a limo parked there, and a guy got out of the limo. It was a white-haired gentleman with a very nice suit. Got out of the car, and I recognized him as our member of Congress, Sam Stratton. And I was about 11 or 12 years old, and I knew the neighborhood well because I went to work with my father a lot. My father said to Sam Stratton, "This is my son. I have a meeting. He's going to show you where to go." And I had no idea what was going on. So my father hands me a piece of paper, says, "Bring the congressman to this address, introduce him to Mr. Alexander on the 4th floor." Okay. So we walked up through the ghetto, and Sam Stratton is like wishing he had his bodyguards. He's scared shitless. Okay. We walk up to Hamilton's Avenue, go up to this tenement, walk up the stairs. There's no doorbells. The door's kind of off the hinges. This is a neighborhood that's about to be torn down to build the New York State Mall, a big office building. Okay, everyone here is going to get moved somewhere else. My father's trying to get the congressman to understand the money that needs to be spent to give these people nice places to live because we're throwing them out of their houses. We go up to the 4th floor. Mr. Alexander is there. When I was about 5, President Kennedy was killed. When Mr. Alexander was about 5, Abraham Lincoln was killed.
Wow.
He lived in the Carolinas. He was a slave. And we talked about it. And he remembers Abraham Lincoln's assassination about like I remember Kennedy's assassination. Don't really remember, but we kind of remember the aftermath. Okay? So I sat with a slave, former slave, who was now 110 years old or something, the oldest man in the city, who was about to get thrown out of his apartment because of the development of Nelson Rockefeller Plaza, with a congressman who wouldn't go to this neighborhood alone because he was afraid. And my father stuck him with an 11-year-old kid.
Wow.
So that was my experience. And at the same time, I knew that all of my father's bosses, who were the board of directors of the housing authority, all of them are black. So
is your father still around?
no, he died several years ago. But my
Okay.
father's bosses were all black, and he proved to a congressman that you could walk around in the black neighborhood and not be knifed by having his little kid take the congressman into a house to meet a former slave.
Yeah.
So I kind of so that's instead of just hearing about racist comments all the time in my household, at least I had that experience and experiences like that. So,
and my last question for you is, what would your father have thought of Ben Carson as HUD secretary?
when my father was head of housing and doing all this, Jimmy Carter was president was elected and offered my father a secretary job. But my father was taking care of his mother and had home issues. He said, "I will be happy to be your secretary of housing in your second administration."
Well, that didn't happen.
Meanwhile, my father was in a fierce rivalry with, what's his name? The guy from Buffalo. He was a Buffalo Bill football player. He was the head of housing in Buffalo, and then he became HUD secretary under Reagan. I'm blanking on his name right now, but they were in a fierce rivalry for funding. So the Republican from Buffalo got to be the housing. So that was kind of but what would you think about Ben Carson? What happened later on in life was my father became very conservative. He became a Rush Limbaugh devotee in his retirement.
Really?
Yeah. So I can't explain.
That's interesting.
It's interesting and depressing and horrible.
Yeah, well,
I don't know what he would have thought about Ben Carson, but it's hard to look at Ben Carson and not be impressed with his inability to do that job.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, to not be impressed with his inability?
His inaptitude, yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Yes, no, I agree.
I think my father would recognize that, because my father was doing his housing thing under Reagan mostly, and he was getting grant after grant after grant after grant from the federal government because he just knew how to do it.
I don't think Ben Carson was incompetent so much as he was not qualified and chosen because he's a yes man.
Sure.
So he did exactly the job that he was appointed to do by President Trump.
Right.
Nothing.
Right.
And the last thing I'm going to say is that I think I was about 5 years old when Reagan got shot, and so we're just now Reagan lived, so he wasn't assassinated, but funny,
right.
If I'm doing the math correctly. I think this was a wonderful conversation. You got any last thoughts, Josh?
No, I think that this was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on through and having this conversation with us. It's been amazing just hearing the stories and trying to figure out the aspect of just racism in general. And seriously, I was in the same mind frame as you stated, that race actually doesn't exist, but is sort of this cultural perpetuation because people see variation of the human race. So they're breaking that variation down into stating that this is an actual different race. Right. And that's why, I might be wrong based on my assessment on this, but I want to try to break that race barrier, because I would rather like to utilize a scientific term for it rather than a 16th century terminology which was used to kind of demonize a specific people to say that these were not humans. Okay. So I think that it's so much better, and I'm trying to advocate for this, that instead of saying, oh, racism, I would love to change it to make, and I know it doesn't have much of a punch as racism, but variationism in a sense, because we all are different variations, but we have to learn of the same human race.
I think all of that entails us learning about the history of race in our country and the world, but certainly from an American perspective, it entails people being acquainted with topics like this and familiar with the history and how it intersects. It requires the teaching of critical race theory, which is pretty much what we did throughout this entire show, but you have that demographic that doesn't want that because they're racists. That might be the controversial statement of the episode, but that's a statement I'm going to leave it on. And I would be happy to revisit this topic. I feel like there's so much more we could talk about it. I mean, there's so much more to cover with respect to race and racism. I'd love to invite you on the show again, Dr. Laden, if you fancy visiting us again.
I would love to do it, and I think this has been a great conversation. I appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you very much. And seriously, it's been a pleasure having you on. It's been so great just hearing your perspectives as well. And
what do you got new coming up?
Say again?
Do you have anything new coming up? Any upcoming projects or?
Do I have anything new? I actually am working on local political issues right now because we have a school board, 2 or 3 or 4. We have 4 school boards elections in the area with CRT, anti-CRT people trying to get on a school board, and they're being very well organized. And I think a lot of them are going to get on our school boards. So we're trying to get other people on, better people on the school boards instead. Same as some local races, city races. So I'm very much embroiled in that kind of political activity right now.
Awesome. Well, we have links to your podcast in the description, and yeah, so for anyone who's watching this, I recommend checking that out, and stay tuned for future episodes of not only Secular Soapbox. We may have you on the Crucible. We're not sure which show yet, but when you come back again, we have Josh has a couple of wonderful shows here that depending on the topic, you would be a great guest for that. So we look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Great. I appreciate it. It'd be great fun.
Absolutely.
Secular Soapbox is on Wednesdays at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can find links to our own PSF Patreon and Facebook pages also in the description. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Promethean Secular Frontier. For Sunny Shell, producer Wes, Kat the Humanist, and Josh the Archon, I am Brycearonee for Team Promethean. We will see you in the future.